She reached across the linen tablecloth and grabbed my daughter's plates right out from under them. She did it casually, stacking the fine porcelain with a sharp clatter, dismissing them as if they were nothing but hired serving staff who had forgotten their place. My two girls sat there, frozen. I watched the flush of hot, deep red shame climb up Marianne's neck, while Lucia just stared at her empty hands. Then came the words. "Mothers of sons, eat first," she announced to the quiet room, her voice bright and hard. "That is how real families work." She smiled when she said it, a triumphant, ugly little smile. I didn't yell. I didn't reach out to stop her. I just sat at the head of my own table, my expression entirely unreadable, watching this woman humiliate my flesh and blood in front of a dozen guests. She grabbed those plates like she owned the room. She did not know those plates, the mahogany table, the roof over her head, and the diamond ring on her finger all came from me. Before I tell you what happened next, I want to be clear about something. I am not proud of how satisfying that moment became for me, but I am not sorry either. There comes a point in a woman's life when dignity stops looking soft and starts looking like silence sharpened into steel. If you have ever been dismissed at your own table, in your own home, by people eating food you paid for, then you already understand the kind of cold that settled in my chest that night. And if you're listening from somewhere far from me, tell me your city or your country below. I would like to know how many of us have swallowed this same insult. To understand why that moment landed the way it did, you need to know who I had been long before anyone at that table decided I was someone to overlook. I was an estate attorney for 40 years. I spent my working life reading clauses other people skipped, finding the hidden hand inside a pleasant sentence, protecting families from the kind of greed that always arrives smiling. By the time I retired, very little escaped my notice. I had been a widow for 8 years when this happened. My husband Robert had been the sort of man who made a house feel settled just by walking into it. We raised 3 children there, my son Derek and my daughters, Marianne and Lucia. They were all grown by then, with grey beginning at the temples and opinions of their own, but to me they still carried little traces of who they had been at 10 years old. There was one thing in my home I treated almost like a living inheritance. My mother-in-law's china, cream-coloured porcelain with a thin rim of blue forget-me-nots, and a gold edge worn faint in places by decades of careful use. I brought it out only for births, engagements, anniversaries, and holidays that meant something. I washed every piece by hand. Robert's mother had trusted me with it, and I never forgot that trust. When Derek married Vivian, I welcomed her. Not warmly at first, perhaps, but sincerely. She had polished manners, expensive taste, and a habit of looking around a room as if measuring what it might one day become. Still, I told myself she was young. I thought she'd soften. When they bought their first house, I quietly paid off the remaining mortgage balance. When Vivian wanted to start her interior design business, I funded it without fanfare. I never asked for thanks, and I never expected praise. Family help, if it is real, should not arrive with a bill attached, but gratitude has a way of revealing character, and entitlement does too. Over time, hers began to show in ways I kept excusing. The shift did not happen overnight. It was a slow, steady drip of small, strange exclusions. Vivian began conveniently forgetting to invite my 2 daughters to her casual Sunday family dinners. When I pressed her about it, she would wave her hand dismissively and say Marianne and Lucia were simply so busy she didn't want to bother them. My son Derek became significantly harder to reach too. He was always in a meeting, always traveling, always letting my afternoon phone calls go straight to voicemail. Then came my eldest grandson's 7th birthday party. I had stepped quietly into the hallway to find the restroom when I heard Vivian's hushed voice floating out from the den. She was kneeling down in front of the boys. "Remember," she whispered, "Grandma's a little confused sometimes. Just smile and nod at her, but don't take everything she says seriously." I stood perfectly still in the hall, my hand tightening on the wooden doorframe. When I finally walked back into the busy living room, Derek looked away. He would not meet my eyes when Vivian spoke. A few weeks later, my son came to me asking for a $40,000 business loan. He claimed Vivian's interior design business was expanding rapidly and they needed capital for inventory. I told him I would think about it. I did not tell him that I had already checked the state registry. Vivian's business had not actually filed any tax returns in over 2 years. The state had administratively dissolved her LLC months ago. There was no business expansion. I said absolutely nothing to my son Derek. I did not mention the hushed conversation in the den, and I did not bring up the tax filings. Instead, I went into my study, opened my filing cabinet, and started a new folder. I've spent my career watching people lie on paper. I know what silence before the ask looks like, so when Vivian invited us all to what she called a family celebration, I already arrived with my eyes open. She said she wanted everyone together for happy news. Her voice on the phone was sugary, almost girlish, and if I had not known better, I might have believed she was reaching for closeness. By then, I knew better. Their house was bright with candles and catered food, every surface polished to a shine. Vivian liked a room to look expensive, even when someone else had paid for the effect. She waited until everyone had a glass in hand before laying one palm over her stomach and announcing she was pregnant again. "Another boy," she said, and the room burst into applause. Derek put his arm around her shoulders. Marianne cried. Lucia laughed and kissed her brother on the cheek. I clapped too. A little later, I excused myself and went down the hallway toward the guest bathroom. The door was closed, but before I reached it, I heard Vivian's voice from the study just beyond. She was on the phone with her mother, speaking in that clipped, confident tone people use when they believe the plan is already won. "Once she's declining, Derek has power of attorney," she said. "We move her into assisted living, sell the estate, and I finally get what I'm owed." I stopped where I was. Then she laughed softly and added, "She's practically senile already. No one will question it." There was a pause while her mother spoke, and then Vivian said the sentence that removed any last excuse I might have made for my son. "Derek agrees we have to do this carefully. He said if we wait too long, his sisters will interfere." My throat tightened, but my hands stayed steady. Years in law had taught me that the body can panic while the mind goes cold and precise. I waited long enough not to be caught listening. Then I walked into the bathroom, counted to 20, and returned to the dining room with my face completely neutral. My daughters were smiling across the table at their brother, unaware. Derek smiled back at them with a champagne glass in his hand. Then I knew this was a takeover dressed up as care. That night, I sat alone in my living room with Robert's photograph in my hands. The house was dark, except for one lamp, and the silence felt thick enough to lean against. I thought about calling Derek immediately. I imagined his voice going defensive, then wounded, then angry. I imagined Vivian's theatrical tears and her insistence that I had misheard, that I was confused, that this was proof of exactly the decline she had been so worried about. I imagined the family cracking down the middle while she stood back and watched. No, a confrontation would only give them time to cover their tracks. Instead, I picked up the phone and called Lucia first, then Marianne. I asked them both to come over right away. When they arrived, I sat them down at the kitchen table and spoke plainly. "I need your professional help," I said, "not as my daughters, as experts. Lucia is a forensic accountant. Marianne practices family law." I told them everything. The overheard phone call, the fake business, the power of attorney, Derek's knowing participation. Their faces went pale, then tight with a grief that looked older than surprise. They had felt Vivian's quiet exclusions for years. Now they understood what those exclusions had been building toward. We talked until the sky began to lighten. By the time they left, we had a plan. I would give Vivian exactly what she expected. I would be agreeable, a little vague, easily managed. I would let her believe her plan was working while my daughters built a case she would never see coming. She wanted a senile old woman? I would give her one. For 3 months. I became exactly the woman Vivian believed I already was. At family dinners, I would pause mid-sentence and ask, "Now, what was I saying?" I called my youngest grandson by his brother's name and let my confusion linger a beat too long. When Vivian offered to help me balance my checkbook, I handed it over with a grateful, trembling smile. She never knew that checkbook was attached to a small household account I had opened just for this purpose. My real finances, the ones that actually mattered, stayed locked in a safe she would never find. Vivian's confidence grew bolder with each passing week. She stopped hiding her condescension and began speaking to me slowly, loudly, as if addressing a child. At one Sunday lunch, she turned to Derek right in front of me and said, "We really should start looking at memory care options, don't you think?" I let my face go soft and vague. I nodded along as if I had not quite followed. Derek shifted in his seat, but said nothing to defend me. Meanwhile, my daughters worked quietly and precisely. Lucia traced the missing $40,000 through shell accounts until she found it, sitting in a personal savings account registered under Vivian's maiden name. Marianne filed a discreet motion to review the power of attorney documents Derek had signed and discovered irregularities that would not survive scrutiny in any courtroom. I retrieved my original will from the safe in my bedroom, untouched and unchanged, and added it to the folder that now took up an entire drawer. Vivian saw an old woman fading. She did not see the file growing thicker each week, or the daughters who visited under the pretense of checking on their confused mother while passing me documents to review. When the folder was nearly complete, I made one final request. I asked Vivian if the next family dinner could be held at my home, and if we might use my late mother-in-law's china. "For old time's sake," I said, letting my voice waver slightly. Vivian smiled with exaggerated warmth and said she thought that would be lovely. The trap was set. The holiday dinner arrived on a cold, clear evening. My home was warm with the smell of roasted meat and the soft glow of candles reflected off my mother-in-law's china. Every piece had been washed by hand and set with care. The table looked beautiful. I had made sure of that. Vivian swept in wearing a new dress and an expression of patient tolerance. She kissed my cheek and murmured, "It must be so hard to host at your age. You really should have let me handle this." I smiled and said nothing. Derek followed behind her, avoiding my eyes the way he always did now. Dinner began calmly enough. The guests filled their plates and the conversation floated from one safe topic to another. Then Vivian decided the moment had come to remind everyone of the natural order. She reached across the table and lifted Marianne's plate right out from under her. Then she did the same to Lucia. She stacked the china with a deliberate clatter and announced, "Mothers of sons eat first. That's how real families work." The room went absolutely silent. I watched my daughters' faces flush with humiliation. I watched Derek stare at his lap. Then I rose slowly from my chair at the head of my own table. "You're right, Vivian," I said. My voice was calm and carried easily across the room. "Only a mother of sons belongs at this table. So let me remind you whose son you married." I reached beneath my chair and retrieved the folder I had placed there before the first guest arrived. I opened it and began to read aloud. Account transfers, forged signatures, the fraudulent power of attorney filings, and finally a transcript of her phone call with her mother. I had recorded it legally, as our state requires only one party's consent. Derek lurched forward. "Mother, stop!" I looked at him and he stopped. Marianne stood and presented the formal legal filing. A motion to revoke Derek's power of attorney and a referral for criminal fraud investigation. Lucia followed, naming the exact dollar amount Vivian had siphoned. $43,600. Vivian's face went pale, then red. She opened her mouth, but nothing came. I set the folder down gently on the tablecloth and looked directly into her eyes. "You spent 3 years telling my grandchildren I was confused," I said. "So let me be very clear. I have never been clearer in my life." The consequences began the next morning, not with shouting, but with paperwork. That was fitting. By the end of the week, Derek and Vivian had been removed from my will entirely. My estate was transferred into a trust overseen by Marianne and Lucia, with protections so tight even I would have admired them in my practicing years. Vivian was served with a civil fraud suit, and the little interior design business she used as a costume finally dissolved under scrutiny. Derek was confronted with every document, every transfer, every signature. He cried once. He apologized never. First he blamed Vivian, then he blamed me for being controlling. Then he blamed the pressure of trying to keep everyone happy. A man tells the truth most clearly when every excuse fails in public. I cut contact with both of them. The grandchildren were teenagers by then, old enough to sense that the story they had been fed did not match what they were seeing. They reached out to their aunts first, quietly, ashamed and confused. I agreed to see them, but slowly, and never alone at the start. Trust can be rebuilt. Carelessly, it can be stolen again. Word of the lawsuit moved through Vivian's polished social circle faster than she could contain it. Invitations dried up. Sympathy did not. Within 6 months, Derek filed for divorce, insisting he had been manipulated. I did not attend a single hearing. I did not ask for updates unless the trust required them. People assume vindication feels like triumph. It didn't. I did not gloat, and I did not forgive. Some endings are not dramatic. They are administrative, final, and quieter than grief, which is sometimes mercy enough. On a Sunday, 3 weeks after the last legal document was signed, I washed my mother-in-law's china by hand at my kitchen sink. Each piece, one at a time. The warm water, the soft cloth, the faint gold rim worn smooth by decades of careful living. I set the table for 3, myself, Marianne, and Lucia. No performance, no audience, no measuring looks across the room. Just my daughters, and my good china used exactly as it was always meant to be used. We ate slowly, we talked about ordinary things. It was the best meal I had shared in years. Some people mistake quietness for weakness. They see an old woman with a soft voice and assume they are looking at an easy target. But I did not survive 40 years in courtrooms by being easy. I survived by paying attention while others performed. Remember this, respect is not a debt your children owe you. But theft is still theft, whether what is taken is money or dignity. Both leave a mark, and remember this too. The children who love you will show you. The ones who don't will show you as well. The difference is simply what they reveal. If you have ever been underestimated at your own table, I would like to hear your story. Leave a comment below, and if this one stayed with you, subscribe. I will be here.